A very good evening to everybody watching us from wherever you're watching us on the continent of Africa and beyond. My name is Bernard Akede and this is Report Desk Africa, the show where we speak to you, or we speak to some of the most popular and, if you permit me to use the word, most trending stories on the continent from the beginning of the week up until now. And we try to, look into these stories with the eyes of reporters, particularly because there are stories that we most likely covered ourselves or some of our colleagues at News Central covered. And so we will be looking into some of these stories again this week. Again, my name is Bernard Akede. Thank you for joining us.
And my name is Blessings Mosugu. And like he said, this is Report Desk Africa. And of course, as always, this promises to be a very insightful segment. We'll be talking about things happening on the African continent, and our focus majorly is going to be, first of all, we'll be looking at the protests against foreigners, which resurfaces in South Africa. Now, that has really caused a lot of uproar between South Africans and foreigners. They are fighting the foreigners, claiming that they are taking the jobs that belong to the citizens of South Africa. We'll also be looking at the returning of looted artifacts to Africa from, British museums and all over the world. So it's going to be an insightful segment, like I said earlier. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after the break with more stories.
Thank you for staying with us. Now, our first story takes us down south, of course, to South Africa, where about 2,000 people were protesting or have been protesting, basically in South Africa, demonstrating against foreigners in Hillbrow Town in Johannesburg as part of what the protesters have called or have coined as Operation Dudula. Now, Operation Dudula is a Zulu word, and this means drive back, and this has gained traction in a sign of growing anti-migrant sentiments down south in South Africa, which has been plagued by record unemployment and rising figures of unemployed youth within the country, and of course it's been worsened by certain levels of poverty and COVID-19. All of this heightened largely by COVID-19. Now, we do know that xenophobic attacks in South Africa remains a crisis that has lingered on for quite a bit of a time. And it has caused concerns in other parts of Africa, particularly in some West African countries, most particularly Nigeria, despite the government's intervention and putting a halt to this long-standing problem. Now, this is not the first time that South Africa is having this kind of issue, and other parts of Africa, other countries that have their nationals living in South Africa are beginning to feel worried. We'll take this report, and when we come back, we'll be talking more concerning this issue. They turned up in a mob of several hundreds at a migrant center in South Africa's Soweto township, unemployed, wielding weapons, and angry with foreigners whom they accuse of taking their jobs. With the unemployment rate at 35% and rising up to 65% among youths, competition for jobs has spawned resentment among some jobless South Africans.
Dudula is a place where you are here to fight for the future of the current and future South African. There's no other reason why we are here.
In the past, xenophobic protests have morphed into violence. Attacks against foreigners left at least 62 people dead in 2008, while another 7 were killed in similar unrests in 2015. Armed mobs descended on foreign-owned businesses around the financial hub Johannesburg in 2019. The ensuing clashes left at least 12 people dead, of whom 10 were South Africans, according to the government. But these protesters say they are here to make a point and not to be violent.
We are here for an operation, and we are here to prove the whole world and to prove the South African police very wrong. We are not criminals.
Last weekend, the same movement held a protest outside a supermarket demanding the sacking of foreign workers employed there.
Our space is occupied by illegal foreigners who happen to be selling drugs on the street. Most of all, they are taking a very simple job that should be done by poor South Africans that does not need any skill.
Around 3.9 million foreigners live in South Africa, a country of almost 60 million, including political refugees, according to official statistics. As fears of yet another wave of xenophobic attacks are brewing, the government has said law enforcement agencies were keeping an eye on the demonstrations while also assuring that law to install a quota for foreign workers in South African companies is being worked upon. Bernard Akede, News Central TV.
All right, there you have it. That is the current unrest going on in South Africa, which is a protest by South African youth against the foreigners who are supposedly taking jobs that belong to them. Now, we understand that this protest is also brewing fears of xenophobic attacks, and this would not be the first time that such fear is coming up. So we'll be joined right now by our correspondent in South Africa, Diane Hawker, to help us understand this situation better. Thank you so much for joining us, Diane.
Thank you so much for having me.
All right, it's good to have you. Now, Diane, we understand that foreign nationals in South Africa are suffering what we call routine xenophobic violence. And, you know, those in South Africa currently, the youth especially, are fighting for what they call jobs that belong to them. You know, so they're trying to take back their jobs from the foreigners. According to them, those jobs should be theirs to begin with, and they've been living in constant fear of being targeted. South Africans say these foreign workers who emigrate to South Africa for economic opportunities are competing against locals for jobs. Now, my question is, they are claiming that, you know, all they want is for foreigners to be fired and then, you know, the South African citizens be hired. How realistic is this? I mean, this seems to be very unrealistic. Now, they also claim that this Operation Dudula was started by Lamini, if I'm not mistaken, and according to him, their aim is to restore law and order. Isn't this ironic, seeing how all we see is an unrest? So how is this supposed to restore law and order? What exactly is the way forward?
Thanks for those questions. I think that we must be mindful of the language that we use in this discussion. There's a significant difference between protest and unrest. What we're seeing at the moment is a protest, which is allowed in terms of the South African Constitution. And if something were to escalate to the level of being unrest, that would be something that would essentially also involve a lot of unlawful activity. In the footage that you actually saw there, you saw that there were police who were standing by to make sure that those people who were expressing their concerns about these job issues were protesting in a peaceful manner and that there were no clashes. And in fact, one of the things that the police did to ensure that law and order persisted was to in certain instances just keep a distance between those who were marching and the people in the area of Hillbrow. So I also just want us to pay attention to the language that we're using, not to create an impression of unrest, which would be something that we saw in July last year, and a very different picture to what's happening right now. Now, in terms of your questions about the job issue, I think the job issue in South Africa is a very, very important one and very crucial, and also it's a very contentious issue. We recently saw, for example, the economic freedom fighters going to some businesses demanding that they are actually hire local people. But it's difficult to enforce something like that, and there isn't any legislation at the moment in South Africa that necessarily disallows businesses to hire foreign workers or migrant workers. It's not something that I think will be resolved overnight. And I'm glad to see that in some instances, the foreign community are actually pushing back. There was a statement that was recently released by a group of migrants in South Africa, calling themselves the Concerned Africans Association, in which they were saying that government needs to do more to actually protect the different migrant communities that are in South Africa.
I mean, one would understand why these foreign nationals will be pushing forward and asking government to protect them, because we've seen this happen, a couple of times. And like you mentioned, the last one we saw in 2019, which got really, really violent, also sparked some reprisal attacks in other parts of Africa, particularly in Nigeria. Now, I quickly want to ask, these jobs, that are being discussed, is it just, are they, white collar jobs, or just the low earning or low paying jobs, I beg your pardon, or just any jobs at all? Are they specific about the kind of jobs that they claim foreigners are taking from South Africans?
Well, not really. I think a lot of the jobs that we know that migrant workers are involved in South Africa are, for example, in the restaurant industry, also in the domestic work industry, and a lot of migrant workers, in fact, own their own businesses in South Africa. So there definitely is some misinformation coming from the Operation Dudula group as to what the situation is. The challenge is, of course, that there are too few people who are working in South Africa at the moment, and your package really captured the unemployment situation quite well, to say that when it relates to young South Africans in particular, that the unemployment levels are extremely high. And unfortunately, many of those people do not have a high level of education. They've passed matric or lower standards, and essentially they would be competing in that lower level of employment for restaurant jobs, for cleaning sector jobs, security type of jobs, not necessarily white collar employment. And that is part of the problem, is that there's a skills deficit amongst many of those who are seeking work in South Africa. And they end up having this conflict over this smaller group of jobs that are available at present.
And then before Blessings goes on. Now, they also mentioned illegal migrants, illegal foreigners. Are they basically targeting just illegal foreigners? How are they able to to differentiate who is illegal and who is not? Without going through without going through due process. What's the yardstick here? Do they how are they able to basically differentiate who from who before saying, these people are illegal migrants who are taking our jobs?
I think it's important to say that the Operation Dudula people do not necessarily have any kind of data. They haven't done any survey. And that's part of what makes this group very problematic, in that they haven't explained how they know that someone might be in the country legally or illegally. There are very many different types of migrants in South Africa. There are those who've come in legally. There are those who've come as a result of the SADC allowance of people being able to be in the country for 90 days without actually requiring any visa. And those would be people like residents from Lesotho, for example, and Swaziland. They don't require any special work to come to South Africa for a 90-day period. We also have asylum seekers, for example, in South Africa. And I think one of the things that academics who have been watching this have been pointing out is that the problem is that the South African government, unfortunately, doesn't treat foreign nationals as well as it could. For example, the refugee reception centers in the country have been closed for almost 2 years now. So even those refugees and asylum seekers who do want to become documented don't actually have access to the refugee reception centers because they've been closed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And the question is, why would the government keep those centers closed if that's an avenue that would allow those who want to come to South Africa and live and work here legally as asylum seekers an opportunity to do so?
All right, now, Diane, let's still talk about survey. Now, we know that they don't exactly know what areas or sectors of job these people are occupying. But let's talk about the actual immigrants. We understand that so many people have immigrated to South Africa over time from African countries, from Asia, for greener pastures. So is there a specific group of people or people generally that these protesters are targeting?
No, absolutely not. I would say that it is a very general and vague protest. And that's part of the problem with it, is that, for example, the most recent protest went to the Hillbrow area. The Hillbrow area is an area of Johannesburg which is known to have a lot of migrants from all over the country. But there's no way of proving necessarily that those migrants are in the country legally or illegally without them having done any prior research. And that is why the Operation Dudula events or protests are very problematic. If you look at the response, from other civil society organizations in South Africa, a lot of them have been very critical about this And even within media houses, there are conversations about how much attention we should give this organization, because you don't actually want to create a situation where by your coverage, you're giving them more oxygen and you're giving them more support, even though their approach is one that doesn't appear to be in line with the Constitution. South Africa's Constitution says South Africa belongs to all those who live in it, not just those who are South African citizens. And that's a very important point to remember when we're covering these types of stories.
Yeah, but I mean, it's difficult not to give them, attention. From the reports we gathered about 2,000 of them took to the streets. That's quite a large number to ignore, And then, as I mentioned earlier, when we saw when scenes like these happened several years ago. There was some level of violence leading to destruction of shops and properties, and even loss of lives, And then again, like I said earlier, it also sparked some reprisal attacks in other countries. I remember I covered some of the supposed reprisal attacks here in Nigeria, and misconception is one thing that spreads across the world, not just in South Africa or in Nigeria. People believed here that since Nigerian stores could be attacked in South Africa, then South African stores in Nigeria should also be attacked. And sadly, a lot of Nigerians paid the price for that, because most of those stores actually belonged to or were run by Nigerians. So, saying it shouldn't be, I totally understand what you mean by saying people should be careful with the kind of attention that is being given. But it's going to be a bit difficult, don't you think, not to give these kind of issues some level of attention, because, it really is sparking fears across countries in Africa, not just within South Africa as a country.
I think that it's the way that all the stories are told, and this is something that all newsrooms, I think, should consider. I'm an editor in South Africa, and we often have to discuss treatment of stories. How do you actually approach a particular story? Are we being critical enough of the message that is being portrayed by this Operation Dudula? Is there perhaps fact-checking that we can do that would help our audiences to understand the picture? And I'm very happy with the package that preceded this, because I think it did paint a picture of the other socio-economic reasons that are inflaming this. So I'm certainly not saying we should ignore the situation, but I'm just saying that it's important to provide the relevant background information, the relevant contextual information, because there are very many socio-economic reasons that are causing this. Unfortunately, a lot of the migrants who live in South Africa do live in areas where there are very high levels of unemployment, where there are poor, extremely poor communities. If you look at Soweto, for example, a very large township, those are the types of areas where you do see the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. You do see the effects of the fact that there's high levels of unemployment. You also see what we call, Nyaupe boys, a lot of unemployed youths who use narcotics, a drug in South Africa called Nyaupe. And all of those things do interact to create, unfortunately, this tense situation. But I think it's also important to note that this is not a countrywide issue. It's something that's happening in Johannesburg, to be specific. 2,000 people in a country of over 50 million people doesn't necessarily reflect the mood of the entire country. And I think it's important for us to reflect that as well.
Right. Now, Diane, let's take a look at a bit of statistics. In 2008, the xenophobic protests that, morphed into violence left at least 62 people dead. In 2015, 7 people were killed in a similar unrest. In 2019, in Johannesburg, ensuing class left at least 12 people dead. 10 of them were South Africans. Now, we understand that this is a peaceful protest and it's not an unrest like you earlier mentioned, and thank you for that, by the way. But are there any measures were there any measures taken in 2019 to prevent such from happening? And are there any measures that are taken now to, prevent it from getting out of hand?
I think that's one of the things that has been a big criticism of government, is that between the time of the different attacks and xenophobic uprising, there hasn't really been any kind of dialogue or a look at how things can improve. So, for example, in 2008, with the first xenophobic violence, one of the things that the South African Human Rights Commission called on government to do was to properly educate South Africans, ordinary South Africans, about what's contained in the Constitution, about migration laws, about how South Africa actually, there was a lot of assistance in terms of South Africa's liberation fight from other people on the continent and other countries on the continent, and also to hold general dialogues that would help people to understand the perspectives that migrants are coming from and why they're actually coming into the country. And one of the criticisms has been that government didn't take that advice and didn't make sure that there was dialogue. And we've seen these things flare up from over and over again, possibly because there's a lack of understanding about the role of migrants in South Africa. Some people erroneously say, for example, that migrants in South Africa don't pay tax. That's simply not true. Everybody who buys a good in South Africa pays tax through value-added tax. So migrants who live and work in South Africa are taxpayers by that virtue. And that's the kind of messaging and information that we certainly need to see more of coming from South African government, coming from civil society, to be able to break down those barriers and make a more of a symbiotic relationship between migrant communities and South Africans.
And then, earlier you mentioned that, solving this issue of unemployment for the South Africans will not, it's not just going to happen overnight. I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to ask that particular question. Now, in the report, towards the end of the report, if you remember, it was also stated that the government did say they'll be looking into the matter and trying to create some kind of quota that will create jobs for migrants while also making South Africans not feel cheated. How do you think this could play out? Is it something that is possible, actually?
I think it would be very difficult to police this kind of thing. South Africa does have a list of scarce skills jobs in which migrant workers can be employed, but those are mainly jobs in the white collar sector, science, and other types of jobs like that. Where this conflict is coming is at a much lower level, at a much reduced level, where in fact it's difficult to police because there are people are being paid more on a cash basis. If you look at the restaurant sector, for example, there's a lot of tips that are involved there instead of an actual formal paycheck. So it's difficult to actually regulate who's being employed. I think the government would really have to take a very close look at the sectors and say, on a sector by sector basis, how they can resolve the issue. There certainly cannot be a one size fits all approach. And I think also there would have to be examination of whether South Africans are interested in those kinds of jobs, or what is the reason why more foreign workers or migrant workers are being employed in certain sectors of the economy, because there might be specific reasons as to why that's taking place. Historically, for example, in the mining sector, there were a lot of migrant workers from outside of South Africa employed there, and that was partly because of the conditions that the mining sector had at play, that it became difficult for South Africans to work in that sector. So that's something that has to be looked at, not from the perspective of the worker only, but also from the perspective of the employer, to say, what are you doing that perhaps is encouraging or discouraging certain groups of workers?
All right. Thank you for that, Diana. Finally, before we let you go, let's talk about some of the challenges that foreign communities face in South Africa. For example, all the refugee reception centers have been closed down since 2020 due to the pandemic. How has the country helped ease some of these, difficulties faced by the foreign nationals?
Yes, absolutely. I think that this also speaks to the role that government can play to make sure that, from their perspective, that they are treating migrants in South Africa with the correct level of care. There are a number of issues that South Africa or migrants and foreigners are facing in the country. The refugee reception center issue is one of the key issues, especially for those who are asylum seekers. There's been a lot of complaints from asylum seekers from across the continent that it's completely unfair for government to have closed these centers. And initially, in fact, they started started closing down some of the centers in some of the further flung parts of the country, making it difficult for them to acquire papers. People who lived in the Eastern Cape, for example, had to travel to Pretoria. Now that puts an additional cost on the migrant in South Africa to have to get their paperwork. So those are the kinds of things that civil society groups and like lawyers for human rights, for example, have been campaigning to say that government needs to get its house in order as to how it treats migrants in South Africa. There's also been a lot of issues, for example, around the permit that was initially given to Zimbabwean workers in South Africa. It was extended over time without there being a clear framework as to what's going to happen when that permit comes to an end. Government recently announced that they won't be extending the permit. But the fact of the matter is that there are Zimbabwean citizens who have been living in South Africa for over a decade now, as a result of the unrest and the unhappiness and the conflict that has taken place in Zimbabwe with the government there. And you can't just discard those people. What happens to them? They have lives, you know? And there's other issues like children who've not been able to obtain paperwork because their parents might be from Lesotho, but they were born in South Africa. We've heard lots of stories of that, especially in some of the border towns where they are sitting in this limbo. What that means is that they can't access services, they can't go to school in South Africa, and thus they become a burden on the state in some way. So it's very important for the South African government to start addressing some of these issues and also showing a level of care, in my view, to the migrants who are in this country. And that might also give an indication to other citizens that that the South African government is actually supportive of what is said in the Constitution.
All right. Thank you so much, Diane, for breaking this down. You clearly have done justice to this particular topic. Like I said earlier, it had been sparking fears in other parts of Africa, particularly countries who had citizens who were affected the last times or the last couple of times when similar demonstrations actually took place. So thank you very much for clearing the air.
Thank you.
Well,
I understand their agitation. Yeah, I mean, everybody, the youths will definitely want jobs, but I think it's kind of excessive to ask that foreigners be fired because South African youths are not having are unemployed. So, well, there possibly is a solution, but that could just be far-reaching.
Yeah, like she said, it's not a representation of the entire South Africa, just a pocket of people.
Fraction,
definitely. Right. So we'll go on a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be moving down, or should I say up this time, towards Western Africa and into Nigeria, where art is coming home. Do stay with us.
Many thanks for staying with us. You're still watching Report Desk Africa, and we're moving on to the returning of the looted artifacts to Africa. I like the way Bernard put it. Art is coming home. Now, European institutions such as the British and French museums are home to some of the world's finest art, many of which experts believe are plunders from the African continent during the colonial era. Now, in recent years, many of these African treasures have been repatriated to the continent. Now, we understand that, or statistics show that 80 to 90% of sub-Saharan African cultural heritage are in Western museums. Last year, 26 works of art seized by French colonial soldiers in 1892 returned to the Republic of Benin. This week, 2 Benin bronzes looted by the colonizing British forces were also returned to Benin City in Nigeria, and that's after 125 years. So that calls for celebration. The restitution of these looted artifacts is definitely a landmark in the long fight by African countries to recover looted artifacts. So we'll take a look at this report and we'll be back to discuss this.
Half man, half animal. This bronze statue depicting the head of the king of Nigeria's ancient Benin kingdom. For more than a century, only a privileged few had access to appreciate the beauty and craft of these arts. After nearly 130 years in foreign lands, most of these artifacts are back to their origin, while others are expected. The University of Cambridge became the first institution to return such an artifact. Similarly, President Emmanuel Macron led a ceremony to return a set of 26 pieces of artifacts looted from France's former colony, Benin. Even as Nigeria joins other recipients to receive African art, what does this mean for Africans?
It actually makes us realize that there are no glass ceilings. We are not inferior. Some of these things were created many years before the British people came in. And we are still standing. All of these nations are still standing despite all of the loot. So it does a thing for the psyche. It does a thing for even the children yet unborn. It gives us an identity. And you need an identity to be an entity in today's world.
Although the return is another milestone in the years-long fight by African countries to recover looted works, some believe the artifact should remain in Europe.
We do not have the right technology, the right environment to be able to manage them and also to be able to keep them. I mean, if you look at the time frame for which this artifact has been taken away, and also the fact of our own maintenance culture.
Colonialism had wiped away all the religious essence of this. Maybe when they come back and we drop blood on top of them, or palm oil, they may wake up again. But honestly, they've slept for so long that they have lost the spiritual essence. They are as important as we want to make them to be now.
What should be in place for the proper management of these artifacts?
The proper thing to do is to set up committees of all stakeholders to get the proper community entry points, to make everybody feel involved in the process and believe that they have ownership of the process. That way, these collective teams will also ask questions of each other.
As numerous European institutions are grappling with the cultural legacies of colonialism, African nations are gradually taking possession of their histories to better build their future. Ni Omani, New Central.
Very, very interesting topic, if you do ask me. And joining us on Report Desk Africa to discuss this very interesting topic is the same man whose voice you heard there in that report, our very own correspondent, Ni Omani. Ni, thank you for joining us. Are you joining us from London or joining from Nigeria, by the way?
From Nigeria for now.
For now? Okay. Let's hope you remain in Nigeria for now. Now, Ni, before we start, Ni and Blessings, I'd just like to let you know that when you mention the Oba of Benin, there's a greeting that follows. So when I say Oba Isokwe, you say Ise. Oba Isokwe. Exactly. So these artifacts are being returned to Benin. Now, Ni, more seriously, let's start coming to you again. About 90% of this African cultural heritage has been delivered to be is believed rather to be in Europe and European countries presently, and these artifacts were stolen over centuries ago during the colonial era. Now, do you think that looting these artifacts was some kind of strategy by the Europeans back then to just, would I say, dispose Africa of its sovereignty and destruction of its traditional tradition and traditional religion and religious heritage? I mean, a lot was done to Africa and African countries. Do you think this was part of it, or this was just for their own selfish interest?
Yes, affirmatively. I can say that it's part of what they used to take away the sovereignty of the continent, and I'll split it into three angles. The first one will be taking away these artifacts were part of a way to strategically shaping the stories around conquest. Now, when these artifacts are displayed in the museums abroad or for people in diaspora, they tell African stories with these artifacts. And you know, it is what they say. It is what they say. They mention it as, okay, we've conquered like the Oba of Benin you mentioned, or we have an artifact that represents the Oba of Benin, and you have it sitting in a museum in Britain, and they go to say, okay, we conquered this particular location, and this is an evidence to show that we've conquered this particular area. So it was strategic. Now, that's the first part. The second part will be for monetary value. Now, what I mean by monetary value is that most of these artifacts add a lot of value. We didn't appreciate it in Africa, but outside the country, there's a lot of things has gone down to making just one art piece, especially in Africa. And these people have come to see it because it tells a story. An African artifact tells a story. It's like documentation of events, documentations of happenings, documentation of ancient tales that have occurred across Africa. So one single piece means a lot and tells a lot of story. And they've seen this ahead that they can convert this and monetize it. Now, the third part will be for social control. Just as the person in the interview said, you know, if you don't, there's a saying that goes, if you don't know your origin, you cannot even know who you are. And it's a way of psychologically tampering with the history. They draw down the download of history along the lines of generations of who they are or what they represent. Especially, you know, back in the days, the Africans are ruled by cultural norms. They are ruled by their cultural standards. They are ruled by most of these artifacts. As someone said at the interview, these represented their own principles. Some are deities, some is whatever they believe they hear, like a divine supreme being. That is who they believe these artifacts are, and that is how they live their life. No, so taking that away from them creates a blank platform where they can get to imprint or put in anything they want. So I think it's strategic. Those three angles are strategic.
All right, thank you, Ni. Before we go further, we're going to be bringing on another guest whose name is Femi Ogunbode. He's a museum curator. Thank you so much for joining us, Femi.
You're welcome. Thank you very much.
Okay, so before you join us, Femi, Ni was just explaining that these arts are not just art. They are things that hold a lot of significance. So I'm going to be asking you that question as well. We understand that Africans have been calling for the return of these artifacts for years now. There's been a lot of back and forth, a lot of discussion as to how to return this work of art to the original owners. So now that we understand that this is not just a work of art, there are things that, you know, that underline the significance of culture, of tradition, and even spirituality. So what are the things you would say are the, the usefulness of these arts? What would you say are the, like I mentioned, the underlining, let's just say usefulness of this artwork? Why should they be returned?
Thank you very much. The reason or the usefulness of this work of art, why they should be returned, is because art is life, and art is what makes man and what makes life keep going. And in the body of existing knowledge of what art is, we have two broad classes of art: mentive art and active art. The mentive art deals more of ideas, things that are abstract, while the active art are tangible things, things we can see. And although in reality, art moves from the mentive art to the active art, but the understanding by the Europeans is if we can get the material culture from them, then we have conquered them. And that was the reason why they had to go that way to steal those artifacts from us, because it's actually our life, it's actually our soul. So for every African, the material culture represents our soul, it represents our being, it represents our existence, it represents our history. And that is the reason why it's so important to the Europeans to get it away from us. Getting it away from us is like they have actually conquered us. Because when what we see, what attracts us is no longer there. So we are left with what we can imagine in our memory. And at a time it will come that we will be suppressed. Our mental ability will not be able to carry it because it's not visible. We might not be able to pass it across to the generation coming after us. And that is the reason why they have made that attempt to take it from us by cutting it away in 1897 when they engaged us in that battle.
Okay, Femi, I want to quickly jump in here. Now, you say we may not, they felt or they feel we may not be able to have the mental capacity to maybe understand or keep these artifacts or these artworks that were stolen. Now, for someone like you who's close to museums, I don't know if you saw that report. Now, one of the people who spoke in that report said some of these artworks may have even lost their meaning to us down here. And that do we even have, the technology? Do we have the infrastructure to maintain them? I mean, you are close to museums here. You see the dilapidating and dilapidated state that most of our museums are in. So bringing these artworks back and then keeping them in our museums, if nothing is done over a period of time, these artworks will go back. I mean, look at example the Bini Mott and some other places that would have been fantastic tourist attractions or tourist centers or pieces of artwork that should have lasted hundreds of years. They've all gone to waste and they're all rotten. Our museums are almost empty. Whereas these pieces of art have been kept in Europe for several years, scores of years, decades, and even centuries, and they're coming back looking as good as the day they were created. So there lies an argument, don't you think? Should they actually really be brought back? Can we maintain them, keep them in good shape?
Do we just want them because of the sentiment?
Exactly. Do we just want them because of sentimental value, or do we actually want them because they are part of our heritage that should be preserved? Okay, I think we lost communication with Femi. Ni, sorry, the mantle of authority now falls on you. So Ni, those questions have to go back to you. Well, not necessarily to you. It's something that we should discuss.
I mean, I really would have loved to hear from Femi,
yeah,
seeing how he works in a museum.
Involved in museums.
And I like what you said about the fact that so many of these things are dilapidated.
Truly.
So sometimes the truth is we might just actually want it because it's for us, but not because we can actually preserve it. What do you think, Ni?
This is what is funny. When Africans travel outside the country and they go to these museums and they see artifacts from their own culture and they appreciate it and they're like, oh, this is the Ober of Benin, this is that. But I can ask you, Ben, Blessings, when was the last time you visited a museum?
I mean, well, the last time I visited a museum, we turned back. I actually wanted to do a report on a museum close.
You wanted to do a report?
Yeah, and you wanted
that's
to do
a personal question.
So one problem that I'll be honest with you, Ni. One problem that we have in certain African countries, and I'll speak for the ones I know, is there's a lot of bureaucracy and red tapeism. So you go to a museum, you want to do a report to talk about some of the issues that the museum may be having, why certain artifacts are lost or are missing, and then you are directed to send a mail or write a letter to an office in the capital, and then waiting for months or weeks for that mail to be responded to before it comes back. It's an entire bureaucratic process.
So which brings me back to this. Now, for so many African countries, they're dealing with a lot of things. There's poverty, there's climate change, there's corruption, there's insecurity that they're battling with.
So museums are not exactly priority.
Exactly. So the first question is it priority? Is it priority for these African countries? While some believe it should be back for maybe sentimental reasons or maybe for revenue, some are actually looking at it as a revenue generation mode, you understand, when you create these museums. But even when they come back, I'll show, because Africans are known for bad administration, naturally, not all, most.
Sadly.
How sure are we that these same artifacts are not going to be sold out again for the same purpose of getting money?
That's a good
And
one.
another thing to consider is the fact that we no longer even teach our children our African heritage anymore. I mean, these are things that should be passed from generation to generation, but the value seems to be depreciating for each generation. Every time it goes from one hand to another, it's like we understand it less. I mean, I'm sure we won't even understand it as much as our forefathers or ancestors used to do. So that's another thing to put into consideration. Children no longer go for excursions in these museums. They no longer care about those things like that.
And they we are actually running out of time. But there quickly is another question that's lying there: digital footprint. Now digital copies of these artworks. Are they coming back? Are we also looking at these at this angle as well?
The truth is, I don't see those blueprints coming back. These are These are cases whereby these people have invested a lot to study, to understand what makes this artifact tick, the creation and everything. I'm not sure they're going to be releasing it just like that. In fact, the foreigners appreciate. Now, let me give you the statistics. Africa contributes a sum of 13 billion US dollars to the global art market in 2018. And according to the source, this figure is predicted to rise by 15 billion US dollar this year. That is outside. When we export this thing, they make more sense. But here in Africa, we hardly even appreciate them. And that is a call for concern. So if we here can't even appreciate the original thing, how much more the blueprints? Who will keep them? Where do we preserve them?
Well, I think that's a good way to leave it there, Nii. Thank you so much for that fantastic report. Actually, it's really giving us a chance to see that we do have artwork and we should preserve our artwork. Thank you so much, Nii.
Thanks to Femi for joining us. Thank you, Femi. Sorry about the technical difficulties, but you really did, expatiate on that, and we're grateful. Thank you.
Yeah.
So much to learn from Africa and African artwork. Yeah. Do we have time for a quick break and then we come back and look at the forecast?
All right, let's do that. So we'll be looking at our crystal ball to see what's going to happen next.
Let's go straight into the forecast then. I think Nii is still standing by to tell us what we will be looking at. Nii, hopefully some more art next week.
Yes. Malawi polio immunization starts next month. Malawi is expected to launch a nationwide polio vaccination campaign, of course, following the detection of its very first case in 30 years. The health minister said the country may recommend mandatory vaccination for travelers to the country to help curb the spread of virus. And of course, Burkina Faso crisis is still lingering. The former ruling party demands release of the former president, Kabore, from house arrest. Different and various parties, even foreign parties, UN, African Union, and ECOWAS have also demanded the release of Kabore. And the last one will be the EU extend sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe. The European Union has extended sanctions in Zimbabwe over human rights violation and closure of the democratic space. Now, these and more are what we should look out for next week.
Thank you so much, Nii, for that information. Clearly, there is so much going on the continent of Africa, and we will keep our eyes on as much as we possibly can. Thank you again, Nii.
Thank you so much, Nii.
And, well, that has been the show.
Yeah, it has. It's been an interesting one
Definitely.
on Report Desk Africa today. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Blessings Mosugu, as always.
And thank you so much. My name is Bernard Akede, and I'm sure Nii is also thanking you from his own corner, wherever he is in part of the continent. Join us again same time next week on Report Desk Africa. Have a lovely evening.